With the championship coming up in most fantasy leagues, a few kickers I looked at off the wire this week. The first kicker, Will Richard of the Minnesota Vikings. So Richard, the games he's played in this season, he's been one of the better kickers in all fantasy football. I know he was on IR from week 10 to week 13 with injury, but ever since he returned, week 14 versus Atlanta 6, week 15 versus Chicago 15, and week 16 at Seattle 12 fantasy points. So week 17, a grinded out type of ball game. I believe it's going to be with the Green Bay Packers coming to town, where it's a division game. And usually we see in a lot of division games this season where points are hard to come by most of these teams, where a lot of field goals are put on the board. So right now, he's out there in tons of fantasy leagues at 92%. He's a kicker with good accuracy, good range, 50-plus yarder isn't a problem for him. And this week, like I said, in a matchup where it's going to be tough to get touchdowns, I believe. He's a kicker there this week. The next kicker, Jason Myers of the Seattle Seahawks, available in 80% of fantasy league. He's on a pretty high-powered offense, I believe, is Myers. And he's gone out there and he's put up quality fantasy points all season long. Week 14 at Arizona 12, week 15 versus Green Bay 9, week 16 versus Minnesota 7, and week 17 a good matchup coming up at the Bears that give up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Chicago's defense hasn't stopped anyone for the majority of the season, especially the last 6-7 weeks. That season fell apart after that Hail Mary touchdown to Noah Brown to win the ball game months ago. So Jason Myers at Chicago, I know Thursday night game, usually high-scoring games, opportunities will be there, but also it's obviously a tough place to play at Soldier Field, especially at a night game with the weather isn't great. So Jason Myers, I still would have confidence in him, and he's out there in 80% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker, Will Lutz of the Denver Broncos. Will Lutz, he's been one of the better kickers in the league this season, out there in 83% of fantasy leagues. Week 13 versus Cleveland 11, week 15 versus Indianapolis 8, and week 16 at the Chargers 12 fantasy points. So week 17 in a potential high-scoring game at the Cincinnati Bengals, a defense that can't stop anyone all season long besides last week versus the Cleveland Browns. I think Will Lutz, he could go out there, he could have a decent ball game. He's got a long-distance boot, and also Sean Payton has a lot of confidence in him that one of the first moves he made was bringing in Will Lutz before the season a couple years ago in a trade with New Orleans. So Will Lutz this week with another pretty good matchup and a potential high-scoring game. Definitely a kicker to add off the wire this week. The next kicker, Chad Ryland of the Arizona Cardinals. So Chad Ryland, I mentioned him a lot this season on the waiver wire. Now 2 weeks in a row with some big ball games, and 3 out of 4 games with double-digit ball games. So week 14 versus Seattle, a down game, 4 fantasy points. Week 15 versus New England, 14. Week 16 at Carolina, 15. And week 17, a good matchup indoors, which is always a plus, obviously, not dealing with other outside stuff at the Rams that give up the 10th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So I think he could go out there once again. Chad Ryland, he's been an accurate kicker. For whatever reason, it just didn't work out for him in New England this season. In his second chance in the league with the Arizona Cardinals, he's gone out there and he's putting up numbers. So definitely a kicker to add off the wire, available in 92% of fantasy leagues. And the final kicker I looked at off the wire this week, Riley Patterson of the Atlanta Falcons. So Riley Patterson, the new kicker for the Falcons. Young Hoku, we know he's on IR. He's going to miss some time, is Young Hoku. And Riley Patterson, he was a decent kicker, bounced around though with Detroit and the Jacksonville Jaguars the last couple of seasons. Game with the Falcons, he had 12 fantasy points. Week 15, he had 1 in Vegas, and then week 16, the 12 fantasy points versus the Giants. So week 17, a potential high-scoring game at the Commanders, where their defense hasn't been great for the majority of the season. I think opportunities could be there for Riley Patterson. He's got a pretty accurate boot. I know he wasn't on a team all season long for whatever the reason was. So far, he's looked okay. I know it's a road game where it's not indoors, but Patterson in deeper leagues can help fantasy owners in a potential high-scoring game, and he's out there in 99% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few kickers I looked at off the wire for week 17 of the fantasy football season.